There is nothing given about the technological social media environment that we currently inhabit. We have to be able to see how design of this particular systems is linked to their business models, and then how those business models then are linked to political agendas or commercial agendas and so forth, and then to try to intervene.
Evgeny Morozov is schrijver en onderzoekt de politieke en sociale gevolgen van het gebruik van technologie. Het komend kwartier praat hij over de onthullingen van Edward Snowden, wat ons dat vertelt over de wereld van nu en de gevolgen voor de toekomst. Welkom bij Tegenlicht Talks.
Well, I wasn't particularly surprised by the fact that we have a sophisticated system of surveillance and data mining and the advanced collection of metadata in the United States, and in part because that's what we have seen in other countries at a less sophisticated and advanced level, but a government that is concerned with fighting threats to its power, and most governments that have been concerned with such threats so far that we know about have mostly been authoritarian states, have been deploying similar technologies for quite some time, whether it's the Russians or the Chinese or the Iranians, and that has happened to be my focus of research. So for me, when we saw some of those programs come out in America, neither the complicity of technology companies nor the fact that National Security Agency is trying to collect everything it can was particularly surprising to me. So, I mean, the extent and the amount of money that was being poured into this was surprising, but the very presence of those programs, to me at least, was not particularly surprising. And all I can tell you is what you read in the news, and the news is that some countries are trying to get away from the American model. Have a lot of activists who are trying to build tools. You have a lot of legal activists who are trying to push for new laws, and where I stand, that's not particularly productive or comprehensive response, in that so far we are going mostly after the low-hanging fruit, and the hackers who know how to build tools continue building tools, and the lawyers who know how to ask for new laws, asking for new laws. My take on the whole issue is that the situation is actually much worse, and that you're seeing the emergence of a new world order, if you will, where data is becoming a new way to pay for things. I think what has happened is that the technology lobby, the Silicon Valley companies, Googles and Facebooks of this world, have managed to convince us that technology somehow exists in almost in a parallel universe to the economy and society and politics, and that it runs on its own logic, it runs on its own laws, and that whenever you say something critical about a particular piece of technology or platform, you're not attacking its political or ideological or economic sort of underpinnings. You're attacking progress itself. So any attack on technology is being seen as an attack on science, as an attack on progress, as an attack on enlightenment. So anyone who goes and starts asking questions about the proliferation of this breathalyzers into cars, or biometric systems of identification, or drones, or anything else, those people are immediately accused of being technophobes. Right? Well, in fact, what they fear is a very particular political and economic agenda. All the data that Google and Facebook are right now collecting will eventually be put to uses other than advertising. It might be used to price risk, might be used to price and figure out, for example, what's the risk that you'll get into an accident if you're driving? What's the risk that your house will set on fire, right? And it was very hard to do that for Google 10 years ago. It's much easier to do it now when Google collects data from your car, not just because of the self-driving car, but also because of the fact that Android, Google's operating system, powers more and more cars. Google controls your bedroom because they control your thermostat and your smoke detector. They control your phone. They'll control your Google glasses. That's the kind of data that that allows them to understand what kind of risks you undergo into everyday life. And if that's what they can do, then they can also be in the insurance business, they can be in the banking business, they can be in many other businesses. And they are actually probably standing to disrupt the banking industry and the insurance industry in the next 5 to 10 years. For me, the greatest problem comes from the suffocation, from the way in which the proliferation of big data and proliferation of data, whether it's generated through surveillance, whether it's bought in the secondary market, allows policymakers, whether those people are in the NSA or CIA, or whether they are people trying to fix the obesity crisis in America or fixing climate change, how it allows them to start solving problems in an entirely new way. So instead of going after the causes and root causes of issues, they just go about the symptoms. So they're trying to focus on the symptoms of a problem rather than trying to figure out why the problem exists. So they do it by, look at, for example, the use of data that might be coming out of, say, a country like Yemen. So you can go and monitor what every single kid in Yemen is doing on Facebook. You can go and monitor what they're doing with their cell phones. You can monitor all of their activities and rank kids in Yemen based on how likely they are to blow up an airplane, right? And so you rank them, and then you have top 10 people, top 10 kids in Yemen, and you just say, well, fine, we're not going to let those people board the plane to America, right? Problem of terrorism solved, right? But then again, to me, a somewhat more ambitious and I think more democratic and more politically conscious way to go about that problem would actually to stop for a little bit and put the data aside and ask a very simple question as to why those kids actually want to blow up American airplanes. And if you do that, you might actually discover that the reason why they do that might have something to do with the use of drone warfare against their fathers. And then you might actually, as a policymaker, you might actually want to reformulate your strategy and figure out how you would not be using drones to go after their families and thus not be triggering those terrorist attacks, right? And my fear is that that's the mode in which we are currently solving problems. We're just suffocating in all this data, and this data does allow us to figure out what we can do to sort of temporarily prevent solving the problem until the next election cycle comes in or until something else happens and people change offices and they all pretend that they're being very ambitious about problem solving, but in fact they aren't. And so, I mean, my concern here is that we're actually entering a new mode of politics where we are no longer talking about what matters. We're not talking about why things happen. We're only talking about how we can keep things the way they are by sort of preventing any possible disruptions, right? And data allows you to do that very well, whether it's data that comes from surveillance or whether it's data that's supplied by people through their cell phones. We are being deprived of if you're drunk. Whether you would want to be doing that, to be drunk at the wheel, is no longer necessary because it just wouldn't start, right? Because again, it can process the data, it can use the sensors to figure out that you're drunk, and then it just wouldn't start. That's the same logic that is now spreading to many other facets of modern life, right? So you don't have the ability to decide not to do something, right? So you might actually say, I don't want to drive when I'm drunk, because I think it's a bad thing. I mean, now you don't even need to decide that because that has been decided for you, right? But I think there is something very profound at the level of how our subjectivities are formed in having this space in which we can morally and politically and philosophically reason our way out to a decision to have the power not to use that power for something else, right? And I know that that's a very subtle point, but the fact that modern technology, and that modern technology, it's not a force of nature. Again, it reflects a particular mode of political and economic arrangements with us refusing to tolerate certain risks We don't in America, and if you look at some of the modern hotels, we don't allow people to open windows unless it's like that, so that they don't fall out. Well, it's a particular decision. It's not a feature of modern windows, all right? So the proliferation of such small architectures of control, if you will, into everyday living. And I think that will actually get even worse with the Internet of Things, with the smart city, with the proliferation of these new smarter infrastructures which incorporate sensors for capturing data, and they incorporate internet connectivity for communicating the data in the cloud, making some decisions and communicating the decision back to the user. I think that will result in us not having that space in which our subjectivity can actually emerge, right, and get formed in an environment where we still have space, if you will, to make decisions that are of our own will and are driven still by some political and ethical and moral idea of what's good and what's not good. What we need is some fundamental rethinking of how our democratic system functions and whether it can actually survive the greater circulation of data on the market, but also greater circulation of the data within its own apparatus. And it might be that there is a certain threshold beyond which, as more data becomes available to our political institutions, the worse they become from the perspective of democracy, in that they take this data and they just make decisions without consulting citizens. So they take this data and then they try to manipulate citizens into doing what they think the right thing is for those citizens when it comes to health, when it comes to energy, and so forth. And if that's the big structural transformation in how politics and economics functions today, then I'm afraid what we need is some kind of new broad-based social movement that will actually start raising questions about how far we should allow our democracies to continue in this mode where we think that more data is always better. And we are not seeing the emergence of that social movement yet, and most of the debate so far is not even willing to address those broad issues. So as long as that's not going to happen, I think we'll continue missing the elephant in the room. And the elephant in the room is that most consumers who are not geeks, who don't go to Computer Chaos Congress in Berlin, those people don't really have such concerns, and they actually have economic incentives to record everything that happens to them and then to figure out how to make money off of it. And if that's the environment in which we are in, then we have to be doing very different kinds of interventions, and I haven't seen them so far. Because this is hard stuff. You need to sit at home and read Weber and Habermas. It's not playing World of Warcraft. It's not like you're going to wake up tomorrow and suddenly understand how the modern system of bureaucracy has come into existence in the last 2 centuries. It's not the kind of thing you can read up on Wikipedia in 2 hours. So I'm not blaming them for not immediately grasping everything that they ought to grasp about how the modern state functions. That would be naive to expect them to do that. But I do think that there needs to be a reorientation of this debate, and people need to start engaging with processes of consumption. They need to understand what are the kind of structural economic incentives that are being given to users right now. Look, in 5 years, whenever you walk down the street somewhere in whatever city you live in, you'll get a pop-up on your phone telling you that would you want to trade all your data from today for 50 euros because there is a retailer next door who wants to create a customized ad and show it to you when you pass through it, right? Those are the kind of decisions we'll have to be making in 5 years. And most people, I'm sure, would be saying yes. They would want to trade their data unless we start articulating an alternative moral regime where people would actually be making some kind of a trade-off between, well, should I be selling my data and making money, or whether that decision would also somehow compromise the political democratic system where I'm living. Right? And this is like the ability to articulate this different logic where people can actually start seeing those questions, not just as questions about benefits and economics, but also as political questions, is something that's missing that ought to be done. But to articulate that alternative logic, you do need to figure out what's the equivalent of climate change is when it comes to proliferation of data. That's the analogy I often use. We know that we don't leave the lights on in our bedrooms when we leave because we can't afford to pay for the bill, right? And we can afford to pay for electricity even if we don't leave the lights on. Why we don't do that? We don't do that because we still think that our decision to leave the lights on is gonna somehow hurt the planet. We don't do it for moral reasons, right? Most of the time, we don't do it because it's gonna hit us economically. I mean, look, I've met quite a few politicians, many of them in Europe, who are willing to listen and with whom I talk every now and then. The problem is that, they're not going to turn it into a major political and social movement that it ought to be, unless they can discursively liberate themselves from this bullshit empire built by Silicon Valley.